This is Walter Bosley, and I'm going to be reading to you the book, The 1,000-Year Conspiracy, Secret Germany Behind the Mask, by Paul Winkler. This is a book written in 1937, before the beginning of World War II, published in this edition by Charles Scribner's Sons, 1943. I'll be reading this in several parts. I will start with the foreword by the author. Foreword. This book attempts to contribute to the work of identification of the forces behind Nazism. It results from research undertaken to substantiate this hypothesis that Nazism is not the product of some spontaneous generation crystallized by Hitler's evil genius, and that it is not, and it has often been described, simply a reaction to the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty. Finally, that Nazism does not derive from some basic trait of the German character. Chapter 1 is introductory. It presents a few characteristic quotations from German writers of the past 150 years. These passages, all written by members of what may be called the Prussian school, are evidence that Mein Kampf is merely a rehash of ideas frequently expressed before Hitler voiced them. But what was the common inspiration of these earlier authors? In seeking an answer to this question, we first perceive the contours of the conspiracy, very old but very real. Its existence, fantastic at first thought, remains the only possible explanation of the facts. Chapters 2 through 7 are an attempt to retrace this centuries-old conspiracy, the actual subject of this book. Chapters 2 and 3 examine in particular the hidden forces responsible for the rise of Prussia and the Germany of Bismarck and Wilhelm II. Chapter 4 introduces the Feme, the blood tribunal of the Middle Ages, into the picture. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 show that Hitler's rise to power would have been impossible had not Hitler placed himself and his movement at the service of the Prusso-Teutonic forces. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, the effort is made to search out behind the specific subject, the so-called actual conspiracy, its fundamental basis. Whatever may have appeared earlier to be a fortuitous development now takes its proper place within an evolution which derives from basic organic causes. In these chapters, we seek the reasons why the Prusso-Teutonic forces have pursued paths completely divergent from those taken by the other peoples of Western civilization. Here, we face the forces behind the forces. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Conspiracy and its Mirror. In 1921, Nazism was still in its infancy and rather harmless. During one of the sessions of the Bavarian Landtag, or Parliament, the deputy Garris, with a heavy pile of documents in his hands, made a statement to the other deputies which none of them seemed able to understand, quoting, "I have here the evidence of 1,000 years conspiracy, evidence which I shall present to you shortly." End quote. A few days later, Garris was murdered. The criminal escaped punishment, and the incident was practically forgotten. The evidence to which Garris had referred was never revealed. It was 18 years after this, in 1939, that German military might began its goose-stepping march across the borders of Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, Greece. Today, it is bent upon world conquest. The forces which launched Germany on the path of conquest are those which were behind the murder of the obscure Bavarian deputy. Those responsible for the conspiracy, which Garris mentioned, decided when he sought to unmask them, to destroy him. It was these men, all members of the same conspiratorial group, who some 18 years later decided that the time was ripe to place world mastery in German hands. Hitler and Nazism have very little to do with this conspiracy, although they occupy the present spotlight. This is not to suggest that Hitler and his party have not been important factors in all the decisive actions for which, during the last 9 years, Germany has been responsible. But these men are only tools in the hands of much more powerful forces. We shall have a great deal to say later about these forces, the Prusso-Teutonic groups and organizations. If we want to win this war, we must see our enemy clearly, and we cannot cure a sick world unless we understand the true nature of the disease. To destroy the evil, we must first identify it, and this will be of equal importance even when the war is over and our problem is to win the peace. The Forerunners of Mein Kampf. We intend to start this identification with the forerunners of Mein Kampf. We cannot expect to locate the roots of evil in the literary field, but literature is a good mirror of much deeper currents. The writings of Trotsky and von Bernhardi and of the other authors of the Pan-Germanic school were widely discussed in the United States and England before and during the last World War. Their connection, however, with the whole evolution of the Prussian idea from the 13th century up to Nazism has in general not been sufficiently emphasized. Mein Kampf is a significant work from many points of view, but this work and its author Hitler are not the source of all evil in present-day Germany. In 1913, more than 10 years before the publication of this work, Mein Kampf, General von Bernhardi, who had enormous influence on the army and the younger generation of Germany, stated in his book, Our Future, quoting, "For us there are two alternatives and no third, world dominion or ruin," end quote. Surplus population as a springboard. In Germany and the Next War, published in 1912, General von Bernhardi had this to say, quoting, "Strong, healthy, and flourishing nations constantly increase the number of their population. Consequently, they will be faced, after a given moment, with the necessity of extending their borders, of acquiring new land, in order to settle the overflowing population. However, since the earth is almost completely settled by this time, acquisition of new land can be gained only at the expense of its present occupants, that is, through conquest, which becomes a law of necessity. The right of conquest is universally recognized. At first this can be effected through peaceful means. Overpopulated countries pour out streams of emigrants in other lands and territories. These emigrants, while submitting to the laws of the new land, try to create favorable living conditions for themselves to the detriment of the original inhabitants, and in competition with them. This means conquest. Finally, the right to conquer through war has always been recognized when an increasing population cannot acquire colonial lands from their primitive and uncivilized occupants, and if it is nevertheless desirable to retain for the state the surplus population which can no longer be supported, there is only one thing left to do. Self-preservation will force this nation to war and to the conquest of foreign lands. Right no longer belongs to the possessor, but rather to those who are victorious in war. In such cases, right belongs to those who have strength either to maintain or to conquer. Might is the highest law. Before its tribunal, war is the gauge of strength. War, whose decisions are always biologically just, since they evolve from the very essence of all things. Even from the point of view of Christianity, one would come to the same conclusion. True Christian morality is, of course, based on the creed of love. Love God above all, and thy neighbor as thyself. This law, however, can claim no validity insofar as relations between nations are concerned, since when applied to politics it would surely lead to a conflict of allegiances. For an individual to profess love for another country would in most cases result in a negating of love for the people of his own country. A political system based on such foundations would surely be subject to the worst aberrations. Christian morality is personal and social and can never become a political reality. It strives to develop the ethical personality and to give it strength so that this personality can live altruistically in the interests of a community. End quote. The cynical frankness of von Bernhardi is as great as Hitler's cynicism. Both resort to hypocrisy when their deductions are too unpalatable for their public. Both consider their special moral conception above discussion and consequently do not discuss it. It is evident from the general's text that he looks upon emigration of surplus population only as a provisional remedy, and that his solution consists of perpetual conquest. He prefers conquest, which, quote, preserves the surplus population, as he put it, for the state. And when he speaks of state, he is thinking, of course, of the German state. He does not explain what natural law makes it necessary to preserve this surplus population for the state, nor why it cannot be peaceably integrated with the populations of other nations if there is no room left in the homeland. That you wish to preserve them for the state is a premise which needs no justification for this preacher of Germanism and Prussianism, quoting, "The very essence of the state is power," end quote, further declares von Bernhardi, and quoting Trischke, that other great theoretician of German power, adds, quoting, "Anyone not sufficiently virile to face this truth squarely has no right to meddle with politics," end quote. Not for a moment does von Bernhardi consider limiting the populations of nations reproducing too rapidly. On the contrary, his point of departure is that strong, healthy, flourishing nations increase their numbers. In this, the conclusion is implicit. The German people, obviously strong, healthy, and flourishing, will always have excess population, and consequently will ceaselessly have to annex territory until they dominate the world. Quoting, "World dominion or ruin," end quote, the final tragic alternative of von Bernhardi's, implies, of course, that if Germany does not succeed in dominating the world, another country will perform this task which awaits the strongest, and in that case the German will go to their ruin. Facing this choice, which he believes inevitable, his decision is made. War as a necessity. Von Bernhardi's so-called indispensable conquest can be accomplished only by war, and the general belief that war should be not a defensive but an offensive operation, or rather outright aggression. He cites the Prussian example as proof of this, quoting, "Indeed, the foundation for Prussia's strength was established by the great Elector through successful wars of his own choice. Frederick the Great continued in the glorious tradition of his noble ancestor. Of all the wars through which he led his people, not one was forced upon him. He never tried to delay the start of any of these wars. In order to deprive his foe of the advantage of the first movement, he would take the initiative by attacking, so that he could assure himself the best chance of success. How successful he was is well known. Had he launched this heroic decisiveness, the entire historical development of European nations and of mankind would have taken a different turn." End quote. Given such a state of mind, the conclusions of present-day pacifists to the effect that war doesn't pay, or if the Treaty of Versailles had not been so harsh, this war would never have broken out, prove singularly impotent. But General von Bernhardi did not invent anything himself. He only reduced to a formula a mode of thought cherished by a series of German predecessors. A century earlier, Dietrich von Bülow, in Modern Methods of War, using a style cleverly veiling by technical military terms purposes none may doubt, said, quoting, If the amount of military resources must sooner or later decide victory, it is obvious that little nations cannot succeed against the big ones, better equipped with war materials. In ancient times, courage and discipline compensated for the inequalities of mass power among nations. Today, however, all moral strength, all individual military talent of the small in number necessarily fails against the great. It is necessary, of course, to make good use of your own superiority of numbers in accordance with modern methods of war, but it remains certain that in modern battle the weak have never conquered the strong unless the latter have made some mistake. Besides, these modern methods of war have been developed only very recently. We shall know better how to benefit from all these advantages in the future. Great empires are not only wealthier, their natural frontiers are more extensive than those of small neighboring states. It happens frequently that a smaller state is completely enclosed within the borders of the larger one. What a double advantage for the latter! I refer here only to small adjoining states. For in the nature of things, it is first necessary to attack one's neighbor before coming to more distant states. If this rule is not observed, countries separating two main adversaries may declare themselves either with or against the great empire. Should they declare themselves against this power, everything is changed, since a coalition of little states is equivalent to one big state. Even in such a case, however, the concentration of power and coercive means in the hands of a single political body may still give the great power a military advantage over any federation of independent states. End quote. Despite the reservations stated in these last lines, if leaders of all the little states successively engulfed by Hitler had taken the trouble to reread these words in time, they might perhaps have been able to decide upon a common course of action instead of maintaining an illusory neutrality until their fall. To get people to accept the idea of perpetual war, indispensable for the achievement of perpetual conquest, philosophical or at least biological arguments are needed. German science finds them and demonstrates that the state of war is but a process of natural selection, permitting the human race to improve itself. Thus von Bernhardi states, quoting, "Without war, inferior or degenerate races could easily pollute and weaken all healthy vital elements by their weed-like growth, and a general decline would be the result. War," says A.W. von Schlegel, "is as necessary as the struggle of elements in nature." End quote. Heinrich von Treitschke, like von Bernhardi, had great influence on the thinking of the generations of Germans immediately preceding Nazism. Treitschke is a conspicuous example of what is known as Prussianism. We shall see later what significance the formation of Prussianism had in the evolution of German thought. Specifically, we shall see that Prussianism is much less an ethnic reality than a special state of mind, a crystallization of thought that has developed over the course of centuries. Through some remarkable process, close examination of Prussianism will permit us to see more clearly into numerous details of the German problem. Treitschke, this typical Prussian, was not legitimately a Prussian at all. Son of a Saxon general, descended on his father's side from a recently Germanized Czech family, a fact he was reluctant to admit, Treitschke was powerfully attracted to the Prussian way of thinking. This Prussian by vocation deemed that only Prussia possessed the necessary strength to dominate all the other German states and lead Germany toward the conquests he so ardently desired. Concerning the concept of war and its role in the existence of nations, Treitschke preached thus to future generations, quoting, "War is not only a practical necessity, but it is also a theoretical necessity, an exigency of logic. The concept of a state implies the concept of war, since the essence of a state is power. The state is the people organized into a sovereign power. A state which renounces war and which in advance submits to an international tribunal gives up this sovereign power, that is, its very self. Whoever dreams of permanent peace asks for something not only unachievable, but absurd. He commits an error of elementary reasoning. War, it is true, may alienate nations from one another, and yet, to a certain extent, it brings them closer together by making them acquainted with their own and their neighbors' resources. War, as an intermediary among nations, is often more effective than universal trade. A nation which clings to the visionary hope of everlasting peace will inevitably end in decay within its haughty isolation. History builds and destroys tirelessly, never weary. She exhumes humanity's divine treasures from the ruins of ancient worlds in order to restore them to a new world. To whoever may believe in this perpetual growth and the eternal youth of our race, it is quite evident that war is an inevitable necessity. That war should be forever banished from the earth is not only an absurd hope, but profoundly immoral. If it were ever realized, we should witness atrophy of many essential sublime forces in the human soul, and transformation of the terrestrial sphere into a vast temple of selfishness. On the other hand, the state has the right to consider itself an end, since it contains the essential conditions for prosperous social life. Every people, and particularly one of high cultural development, runs the risk during a long period of peace of degenerating into egotism. Such a race could consider a great and righteous war which fate may send them as a favor. But the more the comfortable habits of social existence have crept into their spirit, the rougher the counterblow may seem. I have said, fate may send them a war, because the value of this cruel remedy is so rarely appreciated is that no doctor among mankind dares prescribe war as a beneficial potion for a sick people. As soon as a nation hears the echo of this cry of alarm, the state is in peril, our existence is threatened, then awakens the highest virtue, courage of sacrifice, which may never be so freely or widely displayed in times of peace. Among the thousands of men engaging in battle, blindly obeying the will of all, each is aware how little his life is worth compared to the glory of the state. Each feels himself hemmed in by profound forces which dominate him. From this and every important war will spring deep religious feelings and the sublime spectacle, incomprehensible to pure reason, of enemy armies praying to the same God for victory. The grandeur of war is to be found in these acts considered shocking by a debilitated civilization. Men who have never done each other any harm, who accord one another the high esteem one owes his chivalrous enemies, kill each other. They sacrifice in this line of duty not only their lives, but what is infinitely more painful, natural sentiment, the instinctive love for humanity and the horror of blood. The insignificant self, with all its noble and base instincts, must sink into the will of the all. I ask of whoever may find this barbaric, why then has no great beneficial idea of political or religious freedom ever been accepted by men without christening by blood? And why has war been, in every age, the favorite theme of the arts? End quote. The cynicism of Trishka's reasoning is remarkable. War in itself is a blessing, but it would be dangerous to confess it to the people. Instead of such a frank admission, the cry of alarm is sounded. The state is in peril, our existence is threatened, and the people rush into war with enthusiasm. It would be an illusion to believe that Trishka speaks in the abstract, or that his purpose is to develop the theories to benefit humanity. Reasoning in this manner, he hopes to benefit only his own people, whose fate alone concerns him. Quoting, "To whoever may believe in this perpetual growth and the eternal youth of our race, it is quite evident that war is an inevitable necessity," he says. This was written in 1869. The opinions of Trieschke and von Bernhardi are not isolated phenomena, but derive from distant sources. And if we admit that Mein Kampf merely outlines clearly the objectives of a certain Germany without adding anything really new, it is interesting to note that Hitler's spiritual ancestors were in turn descended from a long line of thinkers of similar leanings. It was a mistake on the part of the Western world not to attach in time sufficient importance to this type of thought, which was in violent contradiction to the basic ideas of Western civilization. Doubtless people were lulled by the illusion that such thinking represented purely theoretical fantasies of a few German scholars. They were not able to see that actually such thoughts were extremely significant manifestations of a state of mind having its roots in the distant past, and that these manifestations might in turn result in a very particular and very dangerous way of thinking in future German generations. Later, we shall discuss the early fundamental causes of German aggressiveness. For the moment, let us review briefly more recent spiritual ancestors of Hitler, contemporaries and predecessors of Trieschke and von Bernhardi. This is the end of part 1 of my reading of the 1,000-Year Conspiracy. I will return with part 2 from chapter 1 of the Paul Winkler book.